What's up, everybody? Welcome to this week's episode of Hidden Forces with me, Demetri Kofinas. Today, I speak with Annie Duke, who was, for 2 decades during her professional run, one of the top poker players in the world. In 2004, Annie bested a field of 234 players to win her first World Series of Poker bracelet. The same year, she triumphed in the $2 million winner-take-all, invitation-only World Series of Poker Tournament of Champions. And in 2010, she won the prestigious NBC National Heads Up Poker Championship. Annie has drawn on her undergraduate and graduate work in behavioral and cognitive psychology and her experience in professional poker to advise and consult companies and organizations that want to improve their decision-making. She is also the author of the 2018 book, Thinking in Bets, Making Smarter Decisions When You Don't Have All the Facts. Annie, welcome to Hidden Forces.
Thanks for having me.
How are you doing?
I'm good.
So you said you were coming into town. You just got into New York City?
Yes, I did. I have my suitcase with me.
How long are you going to be in town for?
Just until tomorrow night. So I'm combining this with a few other things. I'm up here quite a bit. Obviously, it's close.
How do you like New York?
Well, I went to Columbia. So
that's right. You went to Columbia for your master's.
No, I went to Penn for
Penn for your master's.
Yeah, I went to Columbia for my undergrad and totally loved it. Never thought I would leave New York City. And in fact, when I applied to graduate school, I only applied to 2 places. I applied to Columbia because I wanted to stay. And then my mentor at Columbia was really encouraging me to apply to Penn, where her mentors were, Lila and Henry Gleitman. So I reluctantly sort of followed her advice. Her name was Barbara Landau, and applied to Penn. And when I came down and visited, I completely fell in love with the program and ended up moving to Philadelphia at that point. But when I lived in New York, if you had asked me, I would have said I would never, ever leave. So
that's really interesting.
Love it here.
Do you feel like you need to be smart to be successful in poker? Because you don't need to be smart to be successful in life. And you said poker is like life in this game, in your book, so...
Yeah, so I think that it's like a lot of things. I think that things can be very domain specific. So, well, I think it's kind of 2 things. Do you have to be able to execute certain things in poker really well? Yes. And if that's your definition of smart, then I suppose you have to be smart to do that. That doesn't necessarily mean that those are going to transfer to other domains, number one. And then also number 2 is that I think that sometimes people can be really good at poker because they've come up with certain strategy and certain tactics that work really, really well in whatever form of poker they're playing. And it's kind of interesting because with some of those people who are great, if you put them in a different form of poker, because there's lots of different forms of poker, they don't do so well. So even within poker, sometimes the skills don't transfer. But what I would say is that the very best poker players in the world, when you take somebody like, for example, Eric Seidel, really deeply conceptually understand what drives the strategy in the game. They're very, very, very smart. And I think those are the ones that last longer. For the same reason that I think, for example, in investing, the people who really stand the test of time really conceptually understand what they're doing instead of just sort of applying tactics that are working. Because as markets change, you have to change what you're doing. And if you don't understand things at a deeper level, I think you don't have that flexibility.
That's so interesting. So how do you feel that your experience in poker and maybe also combining your experience in school with studying psychology helped you to appreciate thinking more deeply about the source of what's causing what you're seeing or what you're experiencing versus the sort of phenomena or the phenomenology of it?
What I would say is I think that there's 2 ways. The first, which I go into pretty deeply in my book, is that the relationship between outcomes and decision quality is pretty loose. And in poker, it's very loose. So what do I mean by that? Well, in poker, I can play a very poor hand. I can play it very poorly. So I can take bad cards, play it poorly, and still win. I can take good cards, play them quite well, and still lose. So what that really teaches you is that you need to understand that just because you lost a hand does not mean you played it poorly. Just because you won a hand does not mean you played it well. And this is a really important lesson to learn in poker that really is true of most things in life as well. You can take like the simplest example. I have run red lights in the past. I have never gotten a ticket. I have never gotten in an accident doing so.
Example.
So, and that doesn't mean that I think that it's a good decision. And the reason why you can see so clearly through to that particular example is because there's so much consensus around that being a poor decision. But imagine, most kinds of decisions that you're making are more opaque. There isn't as much consensus around whether they're good decisions or not. So when you just take outcome quality as a signal, you just take the result as a signal for whether the decision quality was good or not, you're going to be in really big trouble. You're going to think that running red lights is a good idea because you happen to get through safely. And I think that poker really pokes at that in a way that really makes you see kind of the noise in the system.
That's interesting. When you're talking, I'm thinking about the fact that there are certain decisions that we make in life where the outcomes are more closely correlated each time to the decision we make versus other outcomes where they're fat tails, where we could take that bet 1,000 times and it doesn't work out against us, but then that one time it's devastating and it destroys the entire ecology. Would you say that in poker that outcomes are more closely aligned with actions versus life? And in that sense, it gives you a place to practice that on some level?
So this is what I would say is that I think that there are certain things in life where, just as you say, there is this very high correlation. So if we were to divide the world into sort of analogies to two different types of games, we could divide the world into decisions that are like chess, where I make the decision and the outcome is going to be very tightly correlated to the quality of the decision, right? So as an example, if I chose to jump off 1,000-foot cliff.
That'll be the last decision you ever made.
Right. But, the outcome quality is going to be pretty well correlated to the decision quality, right? So, and what you find in chess is that you can actually take the result.
In poker or
in chess. You can take the result and you can really derive what the decision quality looked like. So if we play chess against each other, if you win, it means you made better decisions relative to me. If I win, it means I made better decisions relative to you. And we can even think about like where on the continuum would sports game sit as an example. So, if you take a game like tennis, for example, that's pretty correlated. There's not a ton of luck in tennis. It's pretty high on the skill continuum. So that if I beat you, it probably means that I played better that day. In general, there's some luck, but not too much. And then you can take other things like, for example, the lottery, and obviously there's a lot of luck in there. So in poker, what you find is that the correlation between your outcomes and the quality of your decisions reveals itself over the long run, because the quality of a single outcome in relation to the decision quality is very loose, but it is a game of skill. So that happens to be map onto most of the types of decisions that we make in life, where how it turns out on the one time is not a particularly good signal, whereas in chess it is. But how it turns out in the long run is a pretty good signal.
That's a really interesting point, and I thought about that while reading your book. Two ways in which I thought about it, and both are complementary. One is sort of a slightly biased coin. The extent to which you're skilled is your coin is slightly biased. The more times you flip it, on any given flip, you might be close to 50-50 to come up heads or come up tails. But over the long run, you're more likely to get one outcome than another disproportionately, right? So
you could think about it that way. That's a really good way to think about it. The other way you could think about it is that you have a fair coin, but I'm going to win $1.05 and you're going to win $1. Mm-hmm. Right? So if I'm making that decision, that I understand something interesting about the coin and it's my decision relative to the coin, that's another way that you can sort of get at the same idea. So if I'm going to win $1.05 when we flip and you're only going to win $1, in the long run, I'll end up with all of your money. But in the short run, it's very easy for you to win a few in a row.
How do we think about that in the context of life? Because life is unfair. No question. There are the experiences that we have, and that's something else I want to ask you, philosophically speaking, towards the end of the interview, to comment on how to deal with unfairness on a sort of maybe an emotional, personal, or psychological level, to deal with that fact about life. But life is unfair, but skill obviously plays a role in outcomes. Over the duration of our lives, given the fact that we've had so much opportunity, let's say you have a full life. Let's put aside the sort of existential risk factors that can curtail life. Is it fair to say that skill is disproportionately more important a variable than luck in life? I mean, understanding this is a really difficult question to point out, but I thought about it a bit while considering your work.
Yeah, so we'll get existential. So let me divide that into two pieces. One is that I don't know that I would use the word fair because I think that there's a value judgment there, right? So as an example, some people were born in 1600 when we didn't have vaccines and all sorts of stuff. And some people are born today when we do. So some people might think that people born in 1600 were born at a time which, relative to people today, it was unfair that they were born then. But I think that that's really a value judgment because some people might say, oh, no, it was really nice to live then when there was no technology and people were closer and you can sort of identify the good and the bad in it. And I think that very often what happens is that when we're talking about things that are influenced by luck, it's hard to know at the time without getting some space from it to understand whether it's good or bad luck. And I think that in general, most things are kind of some of both. I'll give you an example from my own life. When I was at the end of graduate school, I was going off to become a professor. And I was actually on my way to my first job talk at NYU. I was trying to get back to New York. And I had been struggling with some stomach issues, and they really came to a head, and I ended up in the hospital for 2 weeks. So I had to cancel all my job talks, and in academics, the job cycle is seasonal. So that meant I had to wait a year while I recuperated. And at the time, I felt this was very bad luck. I felt it was very unfair that, you know, my body had failed me, that I had failed, and that I had gotten so sick. It was during that year, though, that I started playing poker. So was that bad luck? I don't know. Felt like it at the time, but, you know, as I sort of sit here today and I look back on it, I think, oh, well, there was kind of some good luck involved in that because otherwise I don't think that there's a high likelihood that I would have ended up doing what I do. So instead of thinking about fair and unfair, what I like to think about is that there are things that are influenced strongly by luck, where you're born, who you're born to, what time you're born, what your genetics are, those kinds of things. I mean, there's a lot of luck involved in the way that our lives turn out. And instead of thinking about fair or unfair, I think those are the things that are out of your control.
Is another way to say what you're saying that things don't necessarily turn out the way we want them to turn out? So, for example, you didn't want to be hospitalized. If you'd gone back in time, someone asked you, Annie, would you want to spend 2 weeks in the hospital? You'd say absolutely not. But in retrospect, it turned out well for you. But how much of that was really that it wasn't unlucky versus the way you dealt with it or what came out of it as a result of the way you interacted with it?
Yeah, so I think that sort of brings me to the second point, that when we think about the skill elements of luck, it's kind of like, I mean, to use a poker analogy, you're dealt a certain hand and that's totally random. And the decisions that you make in regards to that hand determine the possible set of futures that could occur, some good, some bad. And you have a range, and the decisions determine, first of all, what the set of futures are, and second of all, what the probabilities of any of those particular futures might be. But beyond that, you actually don't have any control over which future occurs, right? So as an example, like going back to the traffic light example, we can think about that pretty simply, right? So I make a decision to go through a green light. I'm following all the traffic rules. I'm paying attention to the person in front of me. I'm going the right speed. My car is in very good repair. So I've made all sorts of good decisions around how am I going to get through the intersection. That determines the set of possible futures. So I get through safely. I get in an accident. I get in a near miss. I run over something and my tire blows. Mechanical failure of the car. We can sort of list out, okay, so what are all kind of the possible things that someone could rear end me? But my decisions determine what the probabilities of each of those futures might be, as well as the set. So I've lowered the probability, for example, that I'm going to get in an accident as I go through. So that's really where I think about it, is that there's all sorts of ways in which we're born with a particular hand. And then even after we're making decisions, the decisions determine the set of possible futures, but only one of those futures can occur. And which one of those occurs is really largely due to a matter of luck.
Would you say that your progression as a poker player and also as a person, I suppose, applying these to your own life, has been an interplay between trying to understand rationally and consciously this probability distribution and then using that to sort of, in some sense, hack or work on your psychology or your physiological disposition? So, for example, like a good example is actually the way that you played a game against your mentor, Eric Seidel. that I've heard you talk about where you felt that if you had to play him on his terms or on skill, you'd lose. And so you made a conscious decision, given that you knew that, to execute a different game plan, which would increase the level of luck. I guess one of the things that I felt in reading your book, and I mentioned to you, I don't play poker, so this was kind of challenging for me. Usually, almost all the interviews we do, I have some, even though I may not know the subject, I have some level of connection to it. This was a unique experience trying to do it. And I thought about this one particular thing, which is that there's a lot of execution in what you're doing, like when you're playing poker, right? And again, the same thing in life. We find ourselves in situations where we can prepare all we like. Same thing with a fight. If you get hit, it changes things. Or if you're diagnosed with cancer, you're in a very different situation than you could think about it, sort of theoretically speaking. So I wonder how you deal with that, how you've dealt with that sort of interplay both in poker and maybe in life. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think it does. So I think I understand what you're saying. So let me try to respond, and then you can tell me if I'm completely off base, because I may think I understand.
I may not be the best.
Don't.
I may not be the best person.
I think I get it, though. So I think that it goes back to your question of fair or unfair. So I think that what we want to avoid is being reactive and being an emotional mind as much as possible. And it's really hard, because when you do have that situation, if you have a very good hand and that you feel you played it well and you still lose, it feels very unfair. It really does. And when you start to think about things as really, really unfair, what happens is that the next decision that you make gets affected in a negative way, because you're thinking about the unfairness of what happened before as opposed to focusing on what next. What should I do next? How do I make a good decision going forward? And this is one of the biggest challenges for poker players, is that, first of all, when they lose, they get emotional and they go on something called tilt, which is a word that I introduce in the book, hopefully for general consumption. It comes from pinball machines. When you shake them, they shut down. And so poker players call that very emotional tilt, because the rational part of your brain shuts down and you start making really bad decisions going forward. And it's something that you really have to defend against, because in poker, when you're playing in a tournament, you don't get to take a minute. You don't get to say, you know what? Let me have a half hour. I'm just going to go wander around, because they're going to be dealing the cards. Your chips are going to be in play anyway. So you've got to figure out, how do I get myself right?
You don't break it all.
There's two different ways to play poker. One is a cash game. You buy in a poker room in a casino, and you can kind of get up whenever you want. You can cash your chips out whenever you want. In a tournament, you play until one person has all the chips.
How long can that go for?
Days.
Wait, but you break, obviously,
But
with
you
a bathroom.
Yeah, so you get a break usually every 2 hours. You get a dinner break. But if you're within that 2-hour time that you're supposed to be playing,
that's interesting.
You can get up and walk away, but you're sacrificing.
That sounds exhausting.
It's totally exhausting.
And you can't even do a sort of, you can't even go to the bathroom to just
Well, you can
flash some water in your face.
Sure, but you're missing hands.
Oh, wow.
So this idea of how do I not allow what feels so unfair to get in the way of the future decisions that you make becomes very much at the fore of what poker players are trying to do. So this is why I challenged you on this idea of fair or unfair. So what I would argue is that if you make decisions and you have a 99% chance of a great result and a 1% chance of a bad result, and you have the bad result, that is not unfair. That's just 1% of the time you're going to see that result. And I think that having that attitude where you get the judgment out of it and you just sort of have this, well, that happened, let me move on, because that was a matter of luck and that was in the set of possible futures that could occur. And what I need to focus on is, how do I improve my decision making, not whether the outcome was fair or unfair, because the outcome was just the outcome. Now, do you execute on that 100% of the time? Not even close. I still, have things where I think, well, that was really unfair. It's hard not to allow your mind to go there. But when you identify that your goal is to view things as that was just in the set of possible futures, and to take the judgment out of it, it does allow you to more often calm down. It does allow you to more often just move on to the next decision and think about how you might improve your decisions. And what ends up happening is things like, that was so unfair, I'm so unlucky, why do things like that happen to me, actually become triggers for you to take a step back and sort of get out of yourself and examine what's going on. So I think that that's really helpful. So that's kind of number one that I think is going on in poker. The other thing is that this sort of, what also goes along with when you have a bad outcome is that when you allow unfair as an option, when you allow, I can't believe how unlucky that was as an option, it gives you an escape hatch from examining how your own decisions might have led to the outcome that occurred. And we really mentally want those escape hatches.
You're assigning blame to the environment.
Right. Something happened to me. That was really unfair. I'm so unlucky. Why do things like that always happen to me? And it's a real escape route from examining your own decisions and taking on maybe some responsibility for why that outcome occurred. So one of the things, and this is why I was very clear and I said your decisions determine the set of possible outcomes, is that whatever outcome occurs is generally not solely a matter of luck or solely a matter of your decisions. It's usually a combination of those. And so what we don't want to do is allow us to escape the examination of our own decision-making process through this kind of use of the word unfair, which kind of allows us to say, well, that was just unfair. That wasn't my fault. So, you know, as an example, like if I go through a green light and I get in an accident, yeah, that was probably mostly a matter of bad luck. I mean, I agree. But if I just offload it to that, then I don't think about whether maybe I could have been more defensive or was I a little distracted and I didn't see the other car coming. And, you know, regardless of the fact that mostly it was probably not my fault because I was going through a green light at the appropriate speed.
Was it you that quoted von Neumann in your book about
Yes.
trees? That's so funny because we just did an episode on information theory and I wasn't sure. I was like, was I reading that in Jimmy Soni's book? And what was the quote? Could you tell our audience?
So about him driving?
Yeah, he said it was about the trees. Like
Yes, yeah, the trees were moving along in an orderly fashion, and then one of them jumped out in front of him.
Did you also
basically.
quote Feynman as well?
I did.
You did,
yes,
right?
I've got
I'm remembering.
Feynman, John Stuart Mill, yeah, von Neumann. Yeah. So anyway, that's why, like, I think that, you know, hopefully I understood what you meant by that. And I think that
I think you understood it better than I did.
We need to think about it in sort of two pieces. One is, how is it getting in the way of learning? How is it getting in the way of improving your decisions? Because you're using this idea of fair, unfair, or unlucky as a way to sort of escape the examination of your own decision process. So that's sort of retrospectively. And then prospectively, when we start really allowing fair and unfair into our thinking, prospectively it affects our decisions going forward because we stay in an emotional place and we're sort of living in the rumination about what happened to us that makes it harder for us to make good decisions going forward. So it's a retrospective and a prospective problem.
Well, it sounds like you're talking about developing a certain equanimity in the face of life's caprice.
That is a very, very good way to put it. And I just want to say, I'm playing Words with Friends right now, and I have Caprice on the board.
I hope not
and
while
I
we're
can't,
doing.
I can no.
Not while we're doing the interview.
I was doing it on the way over, and I have Caprice, and I'm just staring at it because I can't find a place to put it. So you inadvertently needled
See,
me.
we're in sync.
Yes.
But would you say that you've gotten better at that over the course of your life? And it's hard for me also, again, speaking to you, it's hard for me to separate your career in poker with your life in general because so many of these lessons, like your book really isn't about poker.
No.
It's not even necessarily, it is a metaphor, but it isn't even a dominant metaphor. It is the sort of couching metaphor of the book, but it's more like you're writing the book coming from a place of saying, look, I'm someone who's thoughtful and has thought about a lot of these things in my life, and I had the good fortune of being talented and able to compete in poker, and through this experience, I was able to learn more truths about life. It's a sort of existential conversation, I feel like.
I feel like I need to get a clip of you saying that, and then when people ask me what the book is, I'm going to be like, well, just listen to what Demetri said.
That's a great endorsement for this interview.
Well, yeah, no, because I think that that's right. I mean, I want to make it clear, like, you don't have to understand anything about poker in order to understand the book. And first of all, I'm flattered that that's what you think that the book is. And that was definitely what I was aspiring to. Was one of the things that we can think about is, you know, this comes from psychology, is the idea of wicked versus kind learning environments. And kind learning environments there's a lot of feedback, it comes really quickly, and it actually relates to your decisions. So that's
that's what we were talking about before.
Yeah, so chess
having
is a really,
good feedback, immediate feedback.
Exactly. So a wicked environment is where something has fallen apart. So there's a couple of things that could fall apart. One is that essentially the feedback loop is too long. So as an example, if you started smoking in 1920, you wouldn't know for 40 years maybe that you'd finally get the feedback, but it would be way too late. So that would be one way that it can be wicked. The other way is that it's just really noisy, so that the feedback that you get is not particularly well related to the decisions that you make. What I think is interesting is that poker has one thing going for it, which is that the feedback comes very quickly. So we do have a very tight learning loop. It's closed. I make a decision within 30 seconds. I get some feedback on it. So that's good. So that's not like the smoking example. But I think that what people need to realize, because I've actually seen poker used as an example of a kind learning environment, is that certainly at the professional levels, the number of times that you see the cards at the end of the hand, in other words, you show your cards, I show my cards, is only, I think it's between 10 and 15% of the time. I think I use this phraseology in my book. Most hands and in sort of a cloud of hidden information, right? So that the information that you really need to understand some of the things about the quality of your decisions actually mostly doesn't get revealed. And so you're doing a lot of guessing at it.
And bluffing on the other side.
Well, because I don't get to see your cards. So you have these two pieces. You have hidden information so that that limits the quality of the feedback that you get. And then you also have this luck element, which also puts a limitation on the quality of the feedback that you get. And so I think you become very, very sensitive to these issues of what does it mean to try to learn in a noisy environment? What does it mean to try to stay calm? What does it mean to not fall into this idea of things are unfair and things happen to me? And to really get very kind of sanguine about the idea that there's just two things that determine how your life turns out. It's the quality of your decisions and luck. And if you spend all your time focusing on the luck element, you have no control over that. And it's really actually quite amazing how much time we spend on the luck element.
Is that right? So that's another question I have for you, because when I was reading the book, I related more with actually, I think I tend to ascribe, and I have to think about this more. I got to reflect more because I don't think I've done enough of this. Again, reading your book, I thought a lot about, I actually got a little anxious thinking that I should reflect more on my decisions. But I felt like, if anything, I spend more time ascribing blame to myself in circumstances where perhaps I'm more deserving of compassion than the opposite of saying sort of, I was unlucky or whatever else. I wonder really how common is that, and how common is the opposite problem of kind of beating yourself down in cases where you really shouldn't?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of factors that come at play. First of all, I'm pretty sure that highly productive people are actually more likely to blame themselves for their decisions. It's obviously a cue to go in and examine your decisions, which is more likely to make you highly productive. But the vast majority of people fall into something called self-serving bias. So self-serving bias is, if I have a good result, it's because I made really good decisions. If I have a bad result, it's because I was very unlucky. So it's really onboarding good results and offloading bad results. So that's when you're sort of examining for yourself. The opposite pattern also occurs, where people will take on a lot of blame for themselves for their own bad outcomes and actually ascribe good outcomes to luck. It's slightly more likely in women. It's more likely if you're depressed.
Why in women? That's a really interesting question, and I didn't mean to interrupt you, but there's actually a great study. This came up in my research. Let's see if I can pull it up here. There was a study from 1999. I actually want to give a shout-out to my old producer, Justine Underhill, who gave this to me this morning, and it's actually the second time she pointed it out to me. She pointed it out to me years ago. There was this 1999 study that found that Asian American women performed better on math tests when their ethnic identity was activated, but worse when their gender identity was activated, compared with a control group. And I thought that was interesting because when I was reading your book, I was thinking about the importance of mindset and how we frame things and what role that played. But I'm sorry to interject. It was just a good opportunity to bring that up. I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, the answer for me of why it's more common in women is I don't know. So I just know that it is.
Do you think it was common in your case? I mean, did you experience it in your case, do you think? Poker is like, is it predominantly a male?
Yeah, it is.
And you have characters like Jimmy the Greek and Ira the Whale?
Yes. I'm trying to think, was it more common in me? I don't know. I certainly aspire to view good and bad outcomes with more of a clear eye. I mean, I definitely aspire to that. But boy, yeah, no, I did a lot of that. That was so unfair. I can't believe I lost that hand. I played so well. So I'm imagining that I probably fall more into the self-serving bias category. So an interesting thing happens, which is that when we actually evaluate people who we consider to be peers, people who we consider to be people we refer to in order to understand how we're doing. So we all have sort of a reference group. Your neighbor would be good as a reference group. So you think that your dream, like, I'm really going to think that I made it when I get that Volvo, and then your neighbor drives up in a Mercedes and you're like, what? And then you're sad all of a sudden, right? Because it's not about sort of how we're doing in an absolute sense. We compare ourselves to our reference group. So when we're evaluating the outcomes of someone who we consider to be someone we refer to, we actually flip it. So now when they have good outcomes, it's because they got so lucky. And when they have bad outcomes, it's because clearly they're such bad decision makers. So we get that. And then the other thing that we do is when we're just judging from afar. So these are people who we don't refer ourselves to. So let's call this the default, right? So this isn't we're in direct competition or comparison with somebody and we're not evaluating our own outcomes. So this would be the default mode, is that we do something called resulting, which is just good outcome means good decision, bad outcomes means bad decision. So we just use it as sort of a perfect signal for those. And the other thing that I'll say is that one thing I think is really interesting is that, and this actually refers back to this red light example, is that one of the times where we really get resulting to be very strong is when this decision that we're evaluating is innovative in some way. So when there's a lot of consensus around the decision, we allow luck as an explanation. So if I go through a red light and I get in a green light rather, and I get in an accident, you'll allow luck to be an explanation. You'll allow for that because there's a lot of consensus. Like, it's completely agreed upon in society that going through green lights is a good decision. But when we do something that's more innovative, now we're much less likely to allow luck to be an explanation. One of the places we're actually seeing this conversation right now in a way that's really going to affect policy and innovation is in self-driving technology. So there's a study actually that just came out that people won't accept self-driving cars until the technology is 4 to 5 times safer than a human driver, which, obviously if it's 2% safer than a human driver, we should accept it. So you have to ask, what's going on there, right? And I think there's a lot of things that have to do with sort of illusion of control for human drivers, the ability for me to understand what your intent is. So I can say things like, you didn't intend to hurt that person, but I don't really know that about the technology because the technology is a black box. But I think it also has to do with this kind of resulting problem with innovation, that we have consensus around the decision for humans to drive cars and that we've sort of accepted what some of the consequences of that are. And so we're sort of okay with human drivers and what the collateral damage of that might be. But when we're talking about self-driving technology, obviously this is an innovative choice. And so we look at it with a bigger magnifying glass and we're more likely to attach bad outcomes to the decision to actually put these cars on the road being bad. And it's so strong that you can see really how much safer people want the self-driving technology to be before they'll be accepting of it. That's kind of how strong that problem with, not being in the status quo goes in terms of how much blame we're assigning.
It's also interesting what you speak there about control. And that was something else that I thought about while reading a book, which is how much is it that we're uncomfortable with uncertainty, which you bring up, and obviously we are, and how much are we uncomfortable with not having control? Those two things are kind of interrelated.
They are interrelated. So when we think about, there's a variety of biases that have to do with this control element, that we think that we have more control over outcomes than we actually do. So generally when we're the decision makers, we really think we have a lot more to do with the way that things turn out, at least when things turn out well. And we like things that we can control. We don't like to give up control. Even if I were to show you, well, statistically, you're going to be better off in a self-driving car. You're like, no, but not me.
Well, in certain cases, when you're in an airplane, it's kind of scary because you're not in control. But I think most people would be happy to let the pilot take over the plane.
So it's actually interesting because you see this in fear of flying as well, right? That why are people afraid to fly? Because they don't have control over, they accept it because they have to get from point A to point B. But people are very afraid of flying. And for one thing that you see, for example, is that when you sort of give up that control, people are willing to make choices where they feel like they have more control, even if they're less safe. So one thing that happened that was kind of interesting was after 9/11, the transportation deaths went up. Why? Because people weren't flying as much, which is actually much safer. And people were choosing to drive because they felt like this consensus around what it meant to be in a plane. And okay, I'm kind of willing to give up control to the pilot, but that kind of means that they're in control. And like, all right, I'm willing to, all of a sudden, all those fears about not being in control of that particular vehicle really came to the fore, and people started driving across country. And that really spiked accidents and deaths. It wouldn't matter if you said to somebody, no, but you're actually safer at that point flying a plane. This idea of sort of like, well, I understand what my intentions are. I feel like I have control. I can assign intentionality to other drivers on the road. I kind of understand what they're thinking and what their decision process is. That kind of feels better to us. And it is related to the certainty problem, which is the whole idea of sort of this illusion of control is that we think that there's a tighter connection between a decision and an outcome than there actually is.
You write in your book that being smarter makes it worse.
It does.
Is that another way of saying that as we become more experienced or become better at something, we begin to become complacent about the extent to which misfortune or luck or caprice, as we said, can affect me as opposed to what I can control?
So I would say that being smart, making it worse, has to do with your ability to tell a good story. So John Haidt actually says that we all are sort of our own best PR agents, and we like to tell a really good story about ourselves, right? So I want you to think that I'm super smart and that I'm not biased and that I am rational and I interpret the world really rationally and I'm awesome. So there's all sorts of different ways that we kind of get that point across. So here would be a really simple one. The things that I believe, I would like to be true, and I would like you to also believe the things that I believe. And if we disagree, I want you to be wrong and me to be right. Because that's sort of wrapped into the way that we kind of naturally think about ourselves. It's a good thing to move away from. I talk about that in my book. But naturally, we kind of come into the world saying, like, I have these beliefs and I want to affirm these beliefs. So if we want to affirm these beliefs, who's better at slicing and dicing data, at picking out information and analyzing it in a way that supports what they believe? People who are smart or people who are not so smart, right? So there was a really great study by Dan Kahan, which really illustrates this really well, which is this ability to kind of spin things in your favor. So he had people come in and they just analyzed data tables. It was like a 2x2 data table that had to do with skin cream. And people don't really have beliefs about skin cream, so they're coming in with pretty neutral views. They don't have some sort of belief that they want to affirm. And he just sort of divides them up. Here are the people who are pretty good at understanding what a 2x2 tells you in terms of the correlation between things, and people who are not so good at it. So he's got them divided into groups. These are the people who are very good with this kind of data. Here are the people who are not so good with this kind of data. Numerate, enumerate. So now he switches the data to gun control and crime. So what's the relationship between gun control and crime? It happens to be the exact same data that they were very good with when it was like skin cream and, psoriasis or whatever. And what he finds is that, weirdly, the people who were better with the data when it had to do with skin cream are worse when it has to do with gun control. And they make their conclusions conform more to what their previous views on gun control is. If they think that gun control reduces crime, they read the data now as affirming that gun control reduces crime. If they believe that gun control is neutral or increases crime, then they read the data to conform to that belief. And why can they do that? Well, because they're pretty good with numbers, so they can kind of spin it. If you think about it, it's like I can go find studies that will support one view or the other. And if I'm going to spin a story to you, I'm going to be pretty good at telling you why this data is really good and it's very relevant to my belief and why you shouldn't believe this data. And I'm going to be pretty good at actually discrediting that.
This follows on what you just said. When you consult companies or organizations, I suppose one of the things that you're trying to do is you're trying to build a culture of objectivity, objective thinking, questioning, right?
Yeah, openness to dissenting opinions.
So implied in that is that you believe that you can create a culture of openness.
So I think that you can, by actually leveraging some of the sort of biased ways that we process information, weirdly. So what I sort of say is we're sort of built the way that we are. And while it would be really nice for all just to be completely open and to not cling to our own beliefs and to just be mindful and observe the world and all of that, it's kind of unrealistic in terms of the way that on a day-to-day basis we think. And so the way that I think about it is, how do you actually leverage things that get in the way of rational thinking to actually work toward rational thinking? So let me give you an example. One of the things that we know is very bad for processing information and rationality is the tribal nature of human beings. So what you can see is that, for example, your political identification will really drive the way that you process information. It will tell you what to believe, even if those beliefs conflict with what you believed last week. If your tribe switches position, you just switch along with it. It will cause you to be very inconsistent in the way that you evaluate statements from the other tribe versus statements from your own tribe. So as an example, if I take some sort of policy, say a policy on welfare, and I ascribe it to Obama or I ascribe it to Trump, your view of that policy will be determined not by the policy itself, but whether you like Trump or you like Obama.
It's really weird. Do you find that weird? I mean, I know you've studied it. It's odd to me. I mean, obviously that is something that's characteristic of human beings. Some people exhibit it more than others. How much of that is something that you're just kind of born with a propensity for, and how much of that is something that you learn because of your environment?
So I think that we're all born with a propensity for it, and I think that you can see why that might have been good from an evolutionary standpoint to adhere to a tribe, right? Because then you have people cooperating together toward a common goal that I think helps survival when we have these really big heads and big brains, so that we aren't born being able to walk and defend ourselves right away. So we need the protection of the tribe in that way, and we don't have very long claws, and we don't have super sharp teeth, and all of these things where sort of helping each other is really important. And a couple of things that the tribe gives you is something called epistemic closure, which is they kind of tell you what to believe. And you can see how that might be useful, because we can't know everything there is to know, and we can't examine all of the evidence, and most of us accept that the earth revolves around the sun and not the other way around, even though we're not astronomers. And so it kind of tells you the things that you're supposed to believe are true, which is helpful because that allows us to save sort of some cognitive space, but it does cause you to sometimes have some very irrational beliefs. But the other thing that it gives you that I think is important for how do you leverage that for good instead of evil is it gives us distinctiveness. It makes us feel like we're distinct from other people. So when we go back and think about that problem of a reference group, we want to feel good in comparison to the people that we refer to. And one of the ways to do that is to feel that in some way that our tribe is superior to other tribes that might be out there. So that can obviously create a lot of really bad stuff, right? So we can see that in our political discourse right now, that maybe that's not so great. But when you're trying to create a culture around truth-seeking, around saying it's not so important that my prior beliefs be true. What's important to me is that I create a very accurate model of what is objectively true. So this is what we want to do. So now within our group, let's make that part of our distinctiveness, right? What makes us different? I look at other people and they're all just like rationalizing and they're biased, and it's confirmation bias and motivated reasoning and all of this stuff. And they're not trying to find the objective truth. They're just believing what they're told. And they're just clearly arguing to try to affirm whatever their prior beliefs are. But that's not what we do. We do the really hard thing. So one of the things that really made me understand the power of that kind of like, how do I make my culture distinct in this way that aligns with what my long-term goals are, actually comes from my experience in poker. So when you walk down the halls of a poker room during one of those breaks, one of the times that they let you get up from the table during a tournament, what you mostly hear is these groups of players that gather around, and this is what you hear. I cannot believe that guy's such an idiot. How could he beat me in that hand? I played it so well, and I got so unlucky. And oh my gosh, you can't even believe
That's really a common thing. That's odd. I would have expected the opposite.
Common.
That's so interesting.
Common. And then
I would have expected the opposite, given the fact that these are professionals. You're
well,
talking
they're
about
not. I mean, they're all professionals of some degree. So then I tell you my hard luck story, and then you say, "Oh, well, you won't believe what happened to me." And even though you don't really care about my hard luck story, you listen to it. You show me sympathy because you're waiting for your turn to get sympathy back.
Is it just venting though?
Me.
Is it an understanding that you're just venting, or is it something where you've actually convinced yourself of that?
Oh, I think it's something where you've actually convinced yourself. I do.
Was the Annie Duke that was playing poker the same Annie Duke that's sitting at this table, or has this Annie Duke evolved as a result of those experiences? I mean, were you as self-reflective then as you are now? I
think the Annie Duke from Tuesday, February 15th in 1997 is not the same as the one from Wednesday, February 16th in 1997. By the way, I don't know if that was a Tuesday or Wednesday. I'm not like one of those calendar people. I made that up. So no, the answer is no, because hopefully, I mean, there's obviously some ups and downs, but hopefully I'm on some sort of path toward something.
What I'm trying to get at is, how much did your experience playing poker and being in those situations lead to where you are today, where you can write a book and think about this stuff? Because a lot of people write books that incorporate behavioral psychology and probabilistic thinking and things like that. What I think is unique about you is this experience of testing it on such a rigorous basis. And that's what I'm kind of really curious about when you're talking. Like, you give that example, for example.
Yeah. Okay, so I understand what you're saying. So the answer is, would I be here without playing poker? I don't think so, because in poker, it's kind of this thing of like, figure out a way to deal with it or die, because it goes back to that problem of markets change, right? So poker changes. The way that people played poker in 1994 when I started is different than the way that people play poker in 2012 when I retired. So my career spanned 18 years and the game really changed. And if you couldn't understand, okay, maybe I'm losing because I'm not understanding about something that's going on. Maybe my choices aren't so great. If you were just saying, oh, I can't believe these new players, they're such idiots, they don't know what they're doing, you can go broke to that kind of thinking. So I was really lucky. I mean, this again goes back to that cultural thing, which is Eric Seidel in particular really introduced me to this demand for a different way to think. So very early on in my career, I went up to him just like everybody else. And I was like, I can't believe how unlucky I got. I lost a hand or whatever. And he explained to me, okay, you want to be in my tribe? Here's what you have to do to be in my tribe. Why are you telling me this story? What's the point? If you really lost because of luck, then there's nothing for you to learn from it anyway. You're just complaining. And by the way, I lose enough hands. Like, I've got enough emotional baggage trying to deal with my own losses. Like, why do you have to offload that to me? There's no point. You can't control it. It had nothing to do with you if it's really true. Now, if you have a question, if you want to discuss strategy, if you think there's something you could have done differently, maybe you misread your opponent, whatever it might be, maybe you shouldn't have played the hand, then I will sit and talk to you all day. Now, notice what he's told me there is you're not allowed to focus on the stuff that you can't control. You know, life is the way things turn out. It's luck and the quality of your decisions. Don't tell me about the luck part. Don't tell me life is unfair. Because there's nothing you can do about that part. Tell me about the quality of your decisions. That's the thing that you can control. So now what does that do for me? Well, first of all, I want to impress Eric Seidel. He's one of the best players in the world. I want to talk about hands with him. I want him to think well of me. I want him to view me as a peer who can engage in conversation. So now what happens is, first of all, when I go back to the table, I'm no longer as likely to process it in terms of the luck elements. I'm more likely to be looking at places where I made mistakes, or maybe I don't understand what somebody else is doing, because I want good material to go talk to him about. So that's great, right? Then I also get to talk to him about it. That's even better, because I get his advice, which is really good. And it all changes my thinking, because now I say, oh, I'm in this special tribe. So I'm walking down the hall and I hear all of these people complaining about their bad luck, and I feel distinct because I'm going up to Eric, and the best thing that I know I can do when I talk to him is say, I think I made a mistake. And all of a sudden it becomes that I'm deriving all of this feeling of, it's really, honestly, it's driving my ego. It's like, it's not that I don't want to feel better than other people. Like, I haven't become a monk and all of a sudden it's just all about compassion for everybody, even though that's what I aspire to, right? Like, I mean, I aspire to be very just sort of like all equanimity, right? But I also recognize that it's very hard in the moment to get there. So if I can walk down the hall and hear people saying that and sort of feel like, oh, I'm special, I'm in a special kind of tribe that has to do with open-mindedness, that has to do with examination of your own mistakes and feeling good about that, that has to do with not blaming things on luck, but actually looking for the places where you can dig into the decision quality. Now, all of a sudden, look at what that culture did for me. And you can bring that into your own life. You can create that for yourself where it's no longer about let's focus on the unfairness.
Do you think that over the last few decades that our society has become more closed-minded in some important ways, that we've become more of an answers-based culture than even we were, and less open to inquiry and sort of saying, I don't know, and being open to doubt?
You know, it's so hard for me to say because I feel like it's hard to parse out how much of it is a change in the way that people think versus how much of it is that it's so out there and in view. So
when you say it is out there and in view, what do you mean?
That people are just tweeting like every second you get to see their closed-mindedness on display.
Opinion, right.
Yeah, and opinions on display in a way that maybe you wouldn't have before. I can tell you this, that the data seems to show that people's political opinions haven't polarized so much as the parties themselves have polarized. And when you think about the tribal nature of politics, that's problematic, right? Because the tribes are telling the people within those tribes what to believe. But I mean, I do think that it's very on display. Now, I would suggest that people read like is it The Tower and the Square or The Square and the Tower? I think it's The Tower and the Square by Neil Ferguson.
Neil Ferguson's book.
Because he talks about this issue of kind of what happens when the communication is coming down from the tower to the square, which is, you know, vertical versus this horizontal person-to-person communication. And, you know, what I do wonder is when we didn't have as many people to communicate with, if you just kind of had to get along better, right? So like you're my neighbor, you're the person I'm going to be interacting with. We might disagree on a bunch of stuff, but we better find the places of agreement, and maybe we're going to moderate each other because we want to get along. And so we want to sort of find the places where we can agree and maybe not be so extremized. But now I can ignore you because we have such this everybody's talking to each other in the square, but now the square has gotten so huge through the internet. So I can just ignore you.
What is that thing that you say about open-minded people make friends?
Yeah. So the point that I make is that one of the things that I feel like really shuts down communication between people is actually expression of certainty. So when I say something to you with absolute certainty, I've kind of shut down the examination. Now, I've shut down a couple of things. One is I've shut down my own curiosity, because if I already know, there's no reason for me to even want to know your opinion. Because I already know the answer. There's no reason for me to go and look for something to read or to learn, because I already know. But also, I've signaled to you that I already know. And that's very likely to shut you down for a few reasons. One is that you might think that you're wrong, and so you don't want to speak up because I've expressed whatever it is with total certainty. The other is that you might think that I'm wrong and you don't want to speak up. Or because I've declared it with certainty, if we do have an interaction and you disagree with me, it will be adversarial as opposed to exploratory. So when you express things and you express your own uncertainty, which is actually just an accurate model of what your beliefs really are, because how could we know anything for 100% certain,
Absolutely.
right? We can approach 100% certainty, but for most of our beliefs, there's too much luck involved in the way that the future is going to turn out, certainly, and there's too much hidden information in terms of our ability to actually form a perfectly accurate belief about anything. So when we're thinking about how do I represent the objective truth, expressing uncertainty is actually part of the way to do that. And it's got this wonderful benefit of telling you that I'm open to your opinion. So here's an example. Let's say that I were to say something. So here's a prediction that people are talking about a lot, and they seem to be declaring it with a lot of certainty. The Democrats are going to take the House in November. So think about the difference between me just declaring that to you versus if I say, you know, I'm reading a lot and sort of looking at the polls, and it looks like there's a good possibility that the Democrats are going to take the House in November. But I don't know. It's 6 months away. And so if I had to guess, I would say it's like, 70% of the time that will happen. Now, if you've got information that is historically interesting, like, oh, well, when the polls were this in this year, actually they didn't end up taking the House, or there was this particular lay of the land in terms of, have you thought about, for example, gerrymandering and whether the polls actually map perfectly onto what the result might be. I mean, I'm just making all this up. But now all of a sudden, if you have information that might actually inform my decision, you are now willing to give it to me. Because I've signaled to you that my belief is in progress, that it's under construction, and I need help building my house.
Which is actually the truth.
Which is actually just the truth. Because, by the way, last time I checked, it's June. So a lot of stuff can happen between now and November. Just on that basis alone, it's tough to declare that particular prediction with certainty.
Also, I mean, for a culture that brands itself as being scientific, and ours does, it's a quite unscientific way to approach things, because you cannot prove something definitively. You can only falsify it definitively. There's a quote, Annie, we're bumping up against the end here, but I have a few quotes of yours, but there's one I really like in particular, and it speaks to exactly what we're talking about, and I want to read it to the audience. We are discouraged from saying, I don't know, or I'm not sure. We regard those expressions as vague, unhelpful, and even evasive. But getting comfortable with I'm not sure is a vital step to being a better decision maker. We have to make peace with not knowing. I really love that quote, and I think it's a lesson that we should learn as a society. I see a lot for myself, and that's why I asked you if you think we're becoming less objective as a society, because I seem to see it. It might be just because I'm getting older, and as I get older, I learn just how little I know and understand. But I see a lot of people, particularly in the media, feeling very comfortable stepping into what would be a discussion or a conversation, but instead is framed as an argument. Always as an argument. Everyone comes set with their position. Their position is something that they need to defend because it's a competition, and there's going to be a winner and there's going to be a loser, as opposed to both being winners because both come out with a more objective understanding of the world, which we cannot know perfectly.
Yeah, so let me just latch on to something that you just said right at the end. One of the ways that I think about this in terms of how do you actually get this culturally into your life, this idea that we want to be seeking the objective truth, is by redefining what the goal of the game is. What does it mean to win? So obviously in the long run, you're going to do better if you have a more accurate representation of the world, because your beliefs are what inform your decisions, and the better your beliefs, obviously, the better your decisions are going to be. So your ultimate goal should be to construct the most accurate view of the world, which means I'm not sure is winning. Because I'm not sure is actually the way to get people to give you all sorts of information. It's a way to keep yourself curious and to constantly be calibrating and updating your beliefs as you get new information in kind of the most open-minded way, right? But that's not what we think winning is. So, I think about sort of what's happening in terms of what you said of you have these people on television and they're expressing these opinions and they're just framing it as an argument, not as in a discussion, and they're declaring things with certainty. And what I really wonder, and I had this discussion with Julia Galef, is it because that's what the consumer demands? Or is it because those people just really believe that they're certain? And that's what I really wonder. Because I think about how horrible it is in politics to be considered a flip-flopper, which I think is a wonderful thing, right? I think when you really reverse a position, that's the time to most celebrate. Because that's where let's say that I believe the earth was flat. And then I get all of this stuff and I learn all these things and now I believe it's round. I've now gone from a very inaccurate opinion to one that's quite accurate. And so obviously all of my decisions going forward that have any relationship to needing to know that about the earth are going to be better for it. So when people do what's called flip-flopping, where they have a full-on reversal of an opinion, I think that we should be celebrating that because, oh my gosh, think about how much better off that person is if they've moved from inaccurate to accurate. But yet, when politicians do it, what do we say? It's an insult. So now the pundits are certainly taking cues from that, right? The pundits don't want to be seen as flip-flopping. They're not on that panel with Anderson Cooper or Sean Hannity or Rachel Maddow or whoever to give some sort of waffly, that's another one that we say waffling, right? To give some sort of waffly, moderated, thoughtful opinion. Well, I think I'm 60%. People will be like, give your opinion, buddy. So, I just don't know. I don't know how much is that we're sort of trained that saying I don't know is bad, that flip-flopping is bad, that waffling is bad, that hedging is bad. versus how much do those people really believe that they're certain? And I suspect it's the former more than the latter.
It's interesting. I wonder about that too. I think on some level, I would like to think that on some level they know that they're uncertain and that scares them and that comes across. I think it's also interesting what you say though, because I think in some sense there's a complex dance. And you mentioned 9/11. Think about 9/11.
Right.
The reaction to 9/11, to the terrorist attacks, and the way in which we needed certainty. We needed to have an enemy, we needed to have a narrative, and everything needed to be constructed just
Black and white.
That's detrimental. Imagine all the potential mistakes that we made heading after 9/11, right? And everything that happened since. How could we have made better decisions if we were able to be more constructive and more objective with our thinking? And I mean, it's a tall order to do that as society, but I think what your book does is it gives some good science and a roadmap for trying to implement it in your own life, which I think is doable. And I think there's one other thing I want to mention, which we didn't talk about, which is the importance of surrounding yourself with people who can give you good feedback. I think that's essential, that whether that's in marriage or whether it's in business partnership, having honest feedback is crucial from people that can step outside and give you that criticism. I think that's really important. And of course, how you deliver that criticism so that you're open to it. Annie, I want to thank you so much for coming onto the show. It was a pleasure.
Thank you. I just went into really interesting places. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And that was my episode with Annie Duke. I want to thank Annie for being on the program. Today's episode was produced by me and edited by Stylianos Nicolaou. For more episodes, you can check out our website at hiddenforces.io. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at Hidden Forces Pod, or send me an email at dk@hiddenforces.io. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next week.